The photograph is small enough to fit in a gloved hand. Sepia-toned. Card-mounted. Dated, 1899, pressed into the corner in fading ink. A mother sits upright, her dress dark and severe, hands folded with practiced stillness. Her daughter stands beside her, chin lifted, hair neatly tied. The studio backdrop is painted to resemble a parlor they likely never owned. Everything about the image suggests order. Respectability. Peace. Until the scan. In a climate-controlled archive, a flatbed scanner hums softly. The light passes once, then again. A researcher leans closer to the monitor, not because anything is wrong, but because something feels off. Zoom in on the eyes, she says. At first, there's nothing. Just the soft blur typical of late, 19th century lenses. But as the image enlarges, the child's pupils refuse to behave like glass and light should allow. They are too dark. Too precise. And within them, faint, crescent-shaped marks that don't reflect the studio lamps. Silence fills the room. A photographic historian is called. He studies the pixels, then the original print. This isn't damage, he murmurs. And it isn't a defect. The investigation begins with ledgers, thick, dust-smelling books from a defunct portrait studio. Names. Dates. A note in the margin, special preparation requested. From there, a journal surfaces in a county archive. A mother's careful handwriting describes a child who stopped sleeping. Who stared for hours at nothing. Who was brought to a photographer as a last attempt to fix what could still be seen. When the negative is examined under modern light, physical alterations emerge, scratches made before development, deliberate and exact. The portrait never changed. We did. And somewhere, a descendant sits in front of the image for the first time, realizing this photograph was never meant to capture a likeness, but to contain something that refused to stay hidden. The discovery begins without drama, the way most historical revelations do, quietly, almost accidentally. The portrait has been requested dozens of times over the decades, usually by students studying late Victorian studio photography or by local historians cataloging family records. It shows no obvious damage. No tears, no burns, no stains. To the naked eye, it is unremarkable. The scan is part of a digitization backlog, not an investigation. The archivist places the card-mounted photograph onto the flatbed scanner, aligns the corners, lowers the lid. A low mechanical hum fills the room as the light bar moves beneath the glass, illuminating the image line by line. On the monitor, the portrait appears as expected, muted browns, soft focus, a mother's stern calm, a child's obedient posture. It's only when the archivist begins routine quality control, zooming in to check contrast and grain, that something subtly resists explanation. The child's eyes do not soften with magnification the way the rest of the image does. Fabric dissolves into threads. Skin becomes a field of silver halide grain. But the eyes hold their shape. At 200%, they seem merely dark. At 400, oddly uniform. At 800, the pupils appear too clean, too centered, lacking the slight asymmetry common in long exposure portraits where subjects struggle to remain still. The archivist pauses, scrolls back out, then zooms in again. The feeling is not fear, yet, but discomfort, the sense that a rule has been quietly broken. She adjusts the histogram. The shadows deepen. And then it appears. Within each pupil, faint curved marks emerge, like shallow scratches or crescents pressed into the darkness. They do not reflect light. They absorb it. The archivist checks the scanner glass for dust, wipes it clean, rescans the photograph. The marks remain, identical in both eyes. This is the moment the image stops being archival material and becomes a question. Late 19th century cameras were limited. Lenses were soft. Exposure times were long. Children blinked. Eyes blurred. Every textbook says the same thing: sharp pupils are rare, imperfections inevitable. Yet here, in a photograph taken in 1899, the child's gaze is unnaturally precise, and altered in a way that feels intentional. The archivist makes a note in the digital record: asterisk, anomaly present, requires further review. Asterisk, it is professional language, carefully neutral. But privately, she saves a cropped image of the eyes to her desktop. Because once you've seen it, you can't unsee it. And because this first, almost invisible irregularity, noticed during a task meant only to preserve the past, suggests that the photograph may not simply be recording a moment in history, but concealing one. The anomaly discovered in the child's eyes, the faint, crescent-shaped marks, prompted the archivist to take the investigation further. What began as a routine scan now demanded precision and patience. Digital enlargement, she realized, could reveal details invisible to the human eye or even to traditional photographic inspection. The original print was delicate, its edges worn and corners slightly curled from more than a century of handling. Any attempt to examine it under a magnifying glass risked damage. But digital technology offered a safer alternative. The archivist scanned the photograph at the highest resolution her equipment allowed, creating a file so large that each pixel became a miniature universe of silver halide grains. On her screen, she could inspect every detail, from the texture of the mother's gloves to the subtle folds in the child's dress, but her attention returned repeatedly to the eyes. Zooming in methodically, she began to notice irregularities that defied conventional explanation. The pupils, at this scale, did not behave like the rest of the photograph. Typically, enlarged sections reveal grain, blur, or distortion. But here, the child's pupils retained a strange rigidity. The faint crescents she had initially noticed became clearer, almost etched into the darkness, their contours unnervingly deliberate. The light in the studio, the soft glow of late Victorian lamps captured in the original exposure, should have reflected differently, yet these crescents absorbed it, leaving the eyes unnaturally hollow. To confirm that this was not a scanning artifact, the archivist repeated the process using different devices, adjusting brightness and contrast, even employing infrared and ultraviolet imaging techniques used in forensic photography. Every scan confirmed the same phenomenon. The child's eyes contained elements that were not simply the result of lens imperfections, chemical development, or fading over time. Something had been introduced, intentionally, subtly, and with precision. The realization sent a ripple of unease through the archivist. Photographic historians she later consulted explained that at the turn of the century, photographers rarely had the skill or motive to manipulate negatives in such a meticulous way. The soft lenses and long exposure times made every portrait a compromise between reality and technical limitation. Yet here was evidence that these natural limitations had been overridden, leaving a trace so small it had survived unnoticed for over 100 years. At this stage, the photograph had transformed from an ordinary family portrait into a puzzle. A seemingly peaceful image now carried a hidden message, almost invisible, whispering questions that demanded answers. Why alter the child's eyes? What was the significance of these subtle crescents? And who, in 1899, had gone to such painstaking lengths to manipulate reality so carefully? The quiet digital enlargement, in other words, had turned what was once a mundane historical object into the first tangible clue of a mystery that would unfold layer by layer, a mystery that suggested the photograph might not merely depict life, but conceal something far more unsettling. By the time the photograph reached a photographic historian, the anomaly in the child's eyes had already sparked tension between curiosity and disbelief. Dr. Elias Thorne, a seasoned expert in 19th-century studio photography, had spent decades examining portraits, cartes de visite, and tintypes. For him, every line, shadow, and highlight told a story, not just of the subject, but of the photographer, the studio, and the era itself. Yet even he paused when confronted with the cropped, digitally enlarged image of the 1899 portrait. The eyes, they don't behave naturally, Dr. Thorne said, leaning back in his leather chair, the walls of his study lined with hundreds of glass plate negatives. He adjusted his spectacles and examined the high-resolution scan on a tablet, fingers tracing the crescent-shaped marks within the pupils. You see this? He tapped the screen gently. This isn't the result of lens aberration or film grain. And it isn't accidental damage. This was altered. He explained that studio photography at the turn of the century was technically limited. Lenses were soft, exposure times long, and children notoriously fidgety, often leaving behind blurred eyes or ghosted expressions. Any variation outside these norms would stand out immediately to a trained eye. What made this image extraordinary and unsettling was the precision of the marks within the child's pupils. They were too symmetrical to be natural. Too deliberate to be overlooked. And yet, they were subtle enough that they could escape notice for over a century. Dr. Thorne suggested that the marks were likely added to the negative itself. Photographers did retouch negatives occasionally, he said, pulling out a magnifying loupe and flipping through a collection of glass plates. Usually, it's minor, softening wrinkles, adjusting shadows, but this is more than cosmetic. Whoever did this knew what they were doing. It required skill, tools, and a very specific intent. The historian proposed a theory that sent a chill through the archivist. The alteration was not simply aesthetic, it was protective. Perhaps the photographer was trying to obscure a detail, to correct a feature that could reveal something painful or private. It's almost like the eyes were a secret, Dr. Thorne said, voice low, a barrier between what we are allowed to see and what was meant to be hidden forever. This expert insight transformed the investigation. What had seemed like a minor oddity, a faint mark in a child's eyes, was now understood as intentional, historically unusual, and deeply purposeful. The photograph could no longer be approached as a simple family record, it demanded a more forensic, methodical inquiry. Every subsequent step, studying ledgers, scanning for physical manipulations, tracing the child's family, was grounded in this critical realization: someone in 1899 had deliberately altered the image, leaving behind a trace that would become the first breadcrumb in a trail leading through history, secrecy, and perhaps even grief. In that moment, the archivist realized they were no longer simply examining a photograph. They were peering into a puzzle deliberately crafted by a hand over a century old, a puzzle that the digital skin had brought back to life. The anomaly was no longer accidental. It was intentional. And it demanded answers. After the historian confirmed that the child's eyes had likely been deliberately altered, the investigation moved from visual analysis into archival research. The question was no longer how the photograph had been manipulated, but why. To answer this, the team turned to the studio's records, a thick, dust-laden ledger housed in a county archive, its leather binding cracked, pages yellowed and brittle with age. Opening the ledger felt almost ceremonial. Each page was lined with cursive entries, dates, clients' names, fees paid, and occasionally, notes in the photographer's shorthand. The first few pages revealed nothing unusual. Then, roughly halfway through, the researchers found the entry corresponding to the date on the portrait, 1899. A mother and daughter were listed, their names carefully written, Margaret Halloway and Elsie Halloway. In the margin, in smaller letters, the photographer had scribbled something cryptic, * special preparation requested. Eyes must remain precise. * the note was startling in its ambiguity. What did special preparation entail? And why emphasize the eyes, above all else? The ledger provided clues that extended beyond the individual session. Other entries from the same year suggested that the studio occasionally received unusual requests, portraits for families who lived in remote rural settlements, some of which had recently experienced tragedy or disease outbreaks. There were no standard explanations, only the repetition of phrases like delicate treatment or handle with discretion. The handwriting itself was meticulous, indicating the photographer took care to note these requests clearly, almost obsessively. The researchers then cross-referenced the names in census records and property deeds from the same county. Margaret Halloway and her daughter lived on the outskirts of a small rural settlement that had experienced a series of misfortunes, a harsh winter, failed crops, and several local illnesses. Newspapers from the period made fleeting mention of a child suffering from an unspecified, chronic condition that left her weak and bedridden. By connecting the ledger to these broader historical records, a pattern emerged: the altered photograph was not a singular act of artistic whimsy. It existed within a context of careful consideration, social circumstance, and perhaps desperation. The family had sought more than a simple portrait, they had commissioned a solution, of sorts, for something that ordinary photography could not capture. The photographer had complied, leaving a deliberate trace in the eyes of the child, a hidden mark that would survive beyond the family's struggles and the passage of a century. In this way, the ledger did more than confirm the identities of the sitters. It revealed that every element of the portrait, from the pose to the lighting, to the almost imperceptible alterations in the eyes, was intentional. It was a historical fingerprint, a bridge between personal tragedy and professional craft, and it became the key that would unlock the next phase of the investigation, the search for personal accounts, journals, and artifacts that might finally explain the reason behind those unnerving crescents in Elsie Halloway's eyes. The ledger had provided names and context, but it was only a framework, a skeleton of fact waiting to be fleshed out with the personal voices of those who lived it. That voice came in the form of a family journal, discovered tucked away in a local historical society's archive, bound in cracked leather and smelling faintly of smoke and earth. The cover bore no name, only a date, 1898. Inside, the careful handwriting of Margaret Halloway detailed a world of quiet suffering and constrained hope. The entries began innocuously, describing the rhythms of farm life, milking cows, tending to the garden, trips to the general store. But by late winter, the tone shifted. One line read, Elsie's eyes grow distant. She watches the room as if seeing through it. I cannot rouse her from the silence. There was no hyperbole here, only the precise, painstaking record of a mother observing the slow erosion of her child's vitality. A week later, another entry described a visit from a traveling photographer, he came as promised. We spoke little. He said he could capture her as she should be seen, the way others might not. The archivist paused at this sentence. It was one thing to note a portrait session, it was another to imply the photographer was offering a service beyond simple documentation. There was a suggestion of intervention, a tacit understanding that the photograph could somehow preserve or correct something in Elsie that reality itself could not. Subsequent entries added chilling context. Margaret detailed Elsie's worsening condition, nights spent staring into corners, an inability to sleep, strange murmurs as though she were responding to invisible voices. She expressed both hope and fear in equal measure, hope that the photograph might capture her daughter as whole, and fear that it could not. The journal also referenced small objects kept by Elsie during the sessions, a worn doll, a locket, and a tiny cloth handkerchief. Each seemed imbued with meaning, as if the child's spirit or essence could somehow transfer through them into the photograph. This journal made the invisible visible. It explained why the photograph had been altered, why the crescents in the pupils existed, and why the photographer had taken care to note special preparation in the ledger. The family was not merely preserving an image, they were attempting to preserve Elsie herself, to correct or contain something that the human eye could no longer see. The historian later noted that such interventions were almost unheard of in mainstream Victorian photography. They were acts of intimate desperation, blending technical skill with an almost ritualistic understanding of image and presence. In this light, the photograph became more than a historical object, it was a witness, a repository of memory, illness, and maternal devotion. The journal, in its precise, anguished handwriting, transformed the portrait from a curious anomaly into a profoundly human story, a child in distress, a mother trying to save her, and a photographer who, in his own quiet way, became complicit in an act of preservation that blurred the lines between art, documentation, and something almost supernatural. By the time the investigation reached the physical negatives of the 1899 portrait, the story had shifted from archival research and historical context to forensic analysis. The journal and the studio ledger had revealed the who, the when, and hinted at the why, but the photograph itself still held secrets that only modern technology could expose. The archivist, working alongside a forensic imaging specialist, approached the original glassplate negative with meticulous care. Under soft LED lighting and using magnification tools designed for delicate materials, they began a detailed inspection of its surface. What they found was subtle at first, tiny scratches, almost invisible to the naked eye, etched across the areas corresponding to the child's eyes. These were not random, they were precise, deliberate. Each mark followed the curve of the pupil and iris, almost as though the photographer had been tracing shapes he wanted to emphasize or obscure. The negative had been physically altered before printing, a painstaking process that left no evidence in the broader composition of the image. The forensic team employed digital microscopy and high-contrast scanning to visualize the alterations. Under this enhanced light, the crescents observed in earlier digital enlargements appeared to. The team also discovered minute inconsistencies in the surrounding areas of the eyes, tiny abrasions on the child's eyelids and subtle softening of shadows that would normally occur naturally in a long exposure. These manipulations suggested the photographer was not simply capturing an image, he was actively shaping it, controlling what could and could not be seen. The child's gaze had been engineered to look precise, calm, and composed, yet the faint crescents hinted at a deeper layer of meaning hidden within. Dr. Thorne, the photographic historian, described the significance. This is an extraordinary example of early photographic intervention. It's not restoration. It's not retouching for aesthetics. It's a deliberate act to contain or communicate something beyond the ordinary photograph, a trace of intent that survives more than a century later. In this moment, the photograph was no longer simply a family keepsake. It was evidence. Every scratch, every tiny alteration, told a story about the people behind the image, the mother, the child, the photographer, and the emotional urgency that had driven them to manipulate reality in such a precise way. The portrait was simultaneously a record, a tool, and a secret container, a delicate balance between art, documentation, and human longing. This forensic analysis provided the final confirmation that the mystery of the child's eyes was not an accident. The crescents were a deliberate, physical intervention, a whisper from the past, preserved in gelatin and silver, waiting for a century later to be read, understood, and felt. The final piece of the puzzle emerged when a living descendant of the Holloway family agreed to view the photograph in person. After more than a century, the image had remained in archives, untouched by the family themselves, a silent witness to events long past. Meeting the descendant, a woman in her late 60s named Eleanor, felt like stepping into a bridge between eras. She had grown up hearing stories of her grandmother and great-grandmother, tales tinged with loss and mystery, but she had never seen the actual photograph. The archivist carefully unwrapped the original print from its protective enclosure and placed it on a table beneath soft, indirect light. Eleanor leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. At first, her eyes rested on the overall scene, the mother's composed posture, the child's delicate dress, the painted backdrop. There was a sense of familiarity, almost comforting, but it was fleeting. When she looked closer at the child's eyes, something shifted. "They're not quite right," Eleanor whispered, a chill in her voice. "It's like she's aware of something I don't understand." She traced the crescents with her finger in the air, not touching the print, as if acknowledging a presence preserved beyond explanation. For her, this wasn't just a curiosity, it was a connection. The photograph had become a bridge to a part of her family's history that had been deliberately hidden, shaped by grief, love, and the extraordinary care of a photographer who understood more than mere optics. Through conversations with Eleanor, the archivists and historians began to understand the broader emotional impact of the image. The photograph was never meant to be ordinary. The alterations were an attempt to protect a child, to memorialize her in a state of calm and peace that reality no longer permitted. It was a decision made by someone who loved her, whether it was the mother, the photographer, or both, to control how the world would see her. The crescents in the pupils were more than marks, they were an act of preservation, a private language, a whisper that survived time. The broader historical context also became clear. At the turn of the century, photography was emerging as both a technical innovation and a cultural instrument. Portraits were not just images, they were legacies, vessels of memory, and sometimes, shields against mortality. This portrait exemplified that dual purpose, it was simultaneously a record and a refuge. Eleanor's reaction underscored the profound human dimension of the discovery. The photograph was no longer a static artifact, it was a living document, carrying forward a family's story of care, loss, and memory. In the end, the centuries-old image achieved what its creators likely intended. It compelled those who looked upon it to pause, to reflect, and to acknowledge the delicate intersection of art, history, and human emotion, a secret preserved in the gaze of a child that had waited more than 100 years to be understood.